Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Cheating Tales Lab. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. Carlos Maloney stood, absently stirring his cooling coffee. His surgical schedule lay forgotten beside him, his attention fixed on the empty driveway visible through the window. 8:47 p.m. Sylvia was late. Again. His phone buzzed against the counter, displaying Nina Adkins' name. The hospital's development director had become more than just a colleague over the years. She'd become the friend he could confide in when things at home started feeling off. "Carlos, are you still coming to review the donor presentations tomorrow morning?" Nina's voice carried its usual efficient warmth. "Of course," he replied, his eyes still fixed on the driveway. "Though I might need an extra coffee. These late nights are becoming a habit." There was a pause on the other end. "Sylvia's working late again?" "Another strategic planning session with Pete Wallace." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Apparently, the hospital board member needs a lot of one-on-one time with pharmaceutical sales representatives these days. "Carlos," Nina's voice softened. "Have you talked to her about how you're feeling?" Before he could respond, headlights swept across the driveway. A sleek black BMW that wasn't Sylvia's pulled up, and he watched as his wife emerged from the passenger side, laughing at something. Even from this distance, Carlos could see Pete Wallace's broad smile as he leaned across the center console. "I need to go, Nina. She's home." Carlos ended the call, setting his phone down with deliberate care. Sylvia breezed through the door moments later, the scent of expensive perfume and wine preceding her. Her dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and her outfit, a form-fitting pencil skirt and silk blouse, looked more suited for a cocktail hour than a business meeting. "You didn't have to wait up, honey," she said, dropping her designer bag on the kitchen island. "These meetings just keep running long. Pete's really pushing to revolutionize our oncology department's drug trials." Carlos watched as she poured herself a glass of water, noting how she avoided direct eye contact. "Must be fascinating work," he said carefully, "especially since the oncology department's drug trials fall under my supervision, and I haven't heard anything about these revolutionary changes." Sylvia's hand paused momentarily as she raised the glass to her lips. "Well, it's all very preliminary. Pete likes to be thorough before bringing proposals to the department heads." She took a sip, then added with a slight edge to her voice, "He says it's important to have all the details ironed out before dealing with the more traditional members of the staff." The implied criticism hung in the air between them. Carlos felt his jaw tighten, but maintained his composed exterior, the same calm demeanor that served him so well in the operating room. Traditional? Is that what he calls following proper protocols and patient safety guidelines? "Don't start, Carlos." Sylvia's voice took on the dismissive tone that had become increasingly familiar. "Not everyone believes in suffocating innovation with bureaucracy. Pete has vision. He sees possibilities where others see obstacles." "Possibilities?" Carlos repeated softly. "And do these possibilities require you to dress like you're going to a nightclub instead of a hospital board meeting?" Sylvia's eyes flashed. "Oh, I'm sorry. Should I wear scrubs to sales meetings? Would that make you feel more comfortable?" She gestured to her outfit. "This is professional attire in the real world, Carlos. Not everyone spends their days hidden behind a surgical mask." The barb struck its target, but years of surgical training had taught Carlos to keep his hands steady and his emotions controlled. Instead of responding, he picked up their shared iPad from the counter, its screen reflecting the tension in his face. "You left your messaging app open," he said quietly, turning the screen toward her. The deleted messages were still visible in the recently deleted folder. "Pete says the slit dress will be perfect for the party. Can't wait to see everyone's reaction, especially Carlos's." Color drained from Sylvia's face, quickly replaced by a flush of anger. "You're going through my messages now? Checking up on me like I'm one of your residents?" "It was open on our shared device, Sylvia. The one we bought together, remember? Back when we still did things together." He set the iPad down, his voice remaining steady despite the storm building inside him. "What happened to us? When did you start needing another man's approval for how you dress?" This is exactly why I need someone like Pete in my corner. Sylvia's voice rose, her carefully maintained composure cracking. You're so busy trying to control everything, everyone. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I want to feel attractive? That maybe I'm tired of living in the shadow of the great Dr. Maloney? Carlos felt the familiar pressure building behind his temples, the same pressure he felt during particularly challenging surgeries. Is that what Pete tells you? That I'm controlling? That I keep you in shadows? He took a careful breath. The same Pete Wallace who's been on the board for what, 8 months? And suddenly he knows our marriage better than we do? Sylvia grabbed her bag from the counter, her movements sharp with anger. Pete sees me for who I am, not who he wants me to be. He appreciates my intelligence, my ambition. He doesn't try to clip my wings every time I try to fly. Your wings? Carlos couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. Sylvia, you've had complete freedom to pursue your career. I've supported every move you've made. But there's a difference between spreading your wings and setting fire to your nest. She was already heading toward the stairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors like angry exclamation points. I'm not having this conversation right now. I have an early meeting tomorrow. With Pete. She emphasized his name like a weapon. We're planning the presentation for the hospital fundraiser. Since you're so concerned about my professional activities, Carlos watched her retreat, noting how her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the banister, a tell she'd had since they first met. It used to endear her to him, that little sign of vulnerability beneath her polished exterior. Now it just made him wonder what else she was hiding. After she disappeared upstairs, Carlos turned back to the window, staring at the spot where Pete's BMW had been parked. The coffee beside him had gone completely cold, much like the knot of dread forming in his stomach. He picked up his phone, thumbing through his recent calls until he found Nina's number again. He started typing a message about tomorrow's donor presentation review, then stopped, deleting the words. Instead, he opened his browser and began searching Pete Wallace's name, adding terms like previous hospitals and board positions. Something wasn't adding up, and if there was one thing his years of surgery had taught him, it was to trust his instincts when things felt wrong. The clock on the wall ticked past 9:30 p.m. as Carlos settled in for what would become the first of many late nights investigating the man who was slowly unraveling his marriage. In their bedroom upstairs, Sylvia lay awake, her phone screen illuminating her face as she typed out a message. He's getting suspicious. We need to move faster. The Metropolitan Hospital's grand ballroom had been transformed for the annual fundraiser, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the elegant crowd below. Nina Adkins stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, watching the guests arrive with the practiced eye of someone who had orchestrated countless such events. Her attention, however, kept drifting to Carlos Maloney, who was engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with a major donor near the bar. Everything looks perfect, Nina, Dr. Sarachun, one of the senior neurologists, commented as she passed by. Though I have to ask, did you see Sylvia Maloney's arrival? That dress is certainly memorable. Nina's professional smile remained fixed, but her grip on the clipboard tightened. She had indeed seen Sylvia's arrival, separate from Carlos, 45 minutes late, and wearing a dress that seemed designed to draw every eye in the room. The red fabric clung like a second skin, with a slit that made the conservative hospital board members' wives clutch their pearls in collective shock. Dr. Chun, would you excuse me? Nina spotted Pete Wallace making his way toward Sylvia, his intent gaze setting off warning bells in Nina's mind. She'd worked in hospital administration long enough to recognize predatory behavior when she saw it. Making her way across the room, Nina positioned herself within earshot of Sylvia and Pete, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. You look absolutely stunning. Pete's voice carried just enough to reach Nina's ears. I told you that dress would be perfect. Though I think your husband might be having an aneurysm. Sylvia's laugh was just a touch too loud, drawing attention from nearby guests. Carlos needs to remember that I'm not one of his surgical instruments to be locked away in a sterile drawer. She took a long sip of champagne, her red lipstick leaving a perfect imprint on the glass. Besides, isn't that the point of these events? To draw attention to what's valuable? Nina felt her stomach turn at the double meaning in Sylvia's words. She'd known Carlos for years, watched him build his department with dedication and integrity. Seeing his wife deliberately undermining him at an event he'd spent months planning made Nina's protective instincts flare. The murmur of conversation in the room suddenly dipped, and Nina turned to see Carlos approaching his wife. His surgical precision was evident in every controlled step, his face maintaining the calm expression he wore in the operating room during critical moments. "Sylvia," his voice was low but carried in the sudden quiet. "Could we speak privately for a moment?" "Actually, Carlos," Pete interjected smoothly, "Sylvia was just about to help me speak with the Hendersons about their potential donation to the new oncology wing. You understand, of course. Business first." Nina watched Carlos's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "I wasn't aware that pharmaceutical sales representatives were involved in hospital fundraising decisions, Mr. Wallace." "Pete's been instrumental in securing new partnerships," Sylvia cut in, her voice carrying a challenge. "Something you'd know if you ever bothered to attend our strategic planning sessions instead of hiding in your oar." The surrounding conversations had dropped to whispers, guests poorly disguising their interest in the unfolding drama. Carlos took a step closer to his wife, his voice dropping even lower. "That dress isn't appropriate for a hospital function, Sylvia. You know that." Sylvia's reaction was explosive, her champagne glass slamming down on a nearby table. "My body, my rules." The words echoed across the ballroom, causing several guests to jump. "I'm tired of your insecure, controlling behavior. Pete says I should be proud of how I look." The silence that followed was deafening. Nina watched as color crept up Carlos's neck, the only visible sign of his distress. Before he could respond, she stepped forward smoothly. "Dr. Maloney, the Rothschilds were asking about your pioneering work in pediatric cardiac surgery. Would you mind?" She gestured toward an elderly couple across the room, providing him with an escape route. Carlos gave a short nod, his professional mask sliding back into place. As Nina led him away, she heard Sylvia's laugh ring out behind them, followed by Pete's lower murmur. "I need some air," Carlos muttered as they reached the far side of the ballroom. Nina nodded, directing him toward a side door that led to a small terrace. The cool evening air seemed to help, some of the tension leaving Carlos's shoulders as he leaned against the stone balustrade. "I'm losing her, aren't I?" The words were barely audible. Before Nina could respond, the door opened behind them. Two women emerged, then stopped short when they saw Carlos. "Oh, Dr. Maloney, we were just—" one began, but her companion grabbed her arm, pulling her back inside. Nina waited until the door closed before speaking. "They were in the restroom earlier. Sylvia was there, talking to some of the younger nurses." She hesitated, then continued. "She was bragging, Carlos, about having both you and Pete Wallace wrapped around her finger. She called it her power play, using your position while enjoying Pete's attention." Carlos's hands gripped the stone railing, his knuckles turning white. "I should have seen this coming. The late meetings, the changed passwords on her phone, the new clothes." He straightened suddenly, his expression shifting to one Nina recognized from their most challenging cases. "Nina, I need you to tell me everything you've heard. Every rumor, every whispered conversation. Something isn't right here, and it's not just my marriage that's at stake." Nina opened her mouth to respond, but movement near the ballroom windows caught her attention. Sylvia and Pete were visible through the glass, standing closer than propriety allowed. As they watched, Pete handed Sylvia what looked like a manila envelope, which she quickly slipped into her clutch. "Carlos," Nina said slowly, "what do you know about Pete Wallace's history before he joined our board?" Before Carlos could answer, the terrace door opened again, revealing Tasha Newton, one of the oncology nurses. Her face was pale, her hands clutching a set of papers. "Dr. Maloney," she said urgently, "I need to speak with you. It's about Mr. Wallace and your wife. And it's not just about their relationship." She glanced nervously over her shoulder before adding, "People's lives are at risk." The hospital's oncology department was eerily quiet at midnight, long after the fundraiser's last guests had departed. Carlos sat in his office, tie loosened and jacket discarded, staring at the documents spread across his desk while Tasha Newton paced nervously before him. I noticed the discrepancies in the trial data 3 weeks ago, Tasha explained, her fingers twisting the hem of her scrub top. At first, I thought it was just administrative errors. But then I started comparing the original patient records with the reports being sent to the FDA. Carlos picked up one of the spreadsheets, his medical training allowing him to quickly spot the altered numbers. They're manipulating the efficacy rates, he said quietly, making the drug appear more successful than it actually is. And the side effects, Tasha added, finally stopping her pacing to lean against the wall. They're underreporting serious adverse reactions. Mr. Wallace's pharmaceutical company is pushing to fast-track approval, and your wife. She hesitated, glancing at Carlos apologetically. Go on, he encouraged, his voice maintaining its professional steadiness despite the turmoil beneath. Sylvia's been changing the documentation before it gets submitted. She has access to both the hospital records and the pharmaceutical company's reporting system. Perfect position to alter data at both ends. Tasha pulled another document from her bag. But here's what really scared me. Carlos accepted the paper, recognizing it as an internal memo from Pete Wallace's company. His blood ran cold as he read the details. A pattern of similar trials at other hospitals, all fast-tracked, all with suspiciously positive results. And at each hospital, a sales representative had been instrumental in managing the data. There's more, Tasha said quietly. I did some digging after I found this. 3 patients from previous trials at other hospitals died from undisclosed complications. The deaths were classified as unrelated to the drug, but when you look at their symptoms, she handed over another set of medical records, her hands shaking slightly. Carlos read through the cases, his medical training allowing him to see the pattern that had been deliberately obscured. They knew, he whispered. They knew the drug was causing organ failure, and they covered it up. A soft knock at the door made them both jump. Nina slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Security said you were still here, she said to Carlos, then noticed his expression. What did you find? Carlos handed her the documents wordlessly. As Nina read, her professional composure cracked slightly. Oh my God, she breathed. And Sylvia's involved in this? Involved? Tasha's laugh held no humor. She's been Pete's partner in this from the beginning. Look at the dates on those employment records. Carlos froze. What dates? Nina quickly flipped through the papers until she found what Tasha was referring to. Carlos. Sylvia applied for the position at the pharmaceutical company 2 months before she met you. And Pete Wallace's name is listed as her reference. The revelation hit Carlos like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, moving to the window of his office that overlooked the hospital's illuminated parking lot. His mind raced through every moment of his relationship with Sylvia, recontextualizing each memory through this new lens. She pursued me, he said quietly, more to himself than his companions. All those chance meetings in the hospital cafeteria, the way she always seemed to know my schedule. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. I thought it was fate. It was calculation. Nina approached him cautiously, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. Carlos, there's something else you need to see. She held out her tablet, displaying an email thread she'd recovered from the hospital's archived servers. These are communications between Pete and Sylvia from 6 months before she took the sales position. They were planning this long before you became chief surgeon. Tasha cleared her throat nervously. That's not all, Dr. Maloney. I found evidence that Mr. Wallace has done this before. He picks hospitals with prominent surgeons, places his people in key positions, and... She trailed off as Carlos raised his hand. A text message had just appeared on his phone. Sylvia, working late again. Don't wait up. Pete and I need to finalize some reports. Carlos stared at the message, his surgical calm finally cracking. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. They're probably altering more data right now, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Every minute we wait puts more patients at risk. We need to be strategic about this, Nina cautioned, her administrative experience coming to the fore. If we move too quickly, they might destroy evidence. We need to document everything, build an airtight case. Nina's right, Tasha agreed, gathering the scattered papers into organized piles. I've been making copies of everything I find, storing them in multiple secure locations. But there's something else that's been bothering me. She pulled up a file on her phone. Look at the pattern of Pete's hospital transfers. Every time an investigation gets close, he moves on. And the sales representatives he works with? They disappear. No criminal charges, no paper trail. They just vanish. Carlos turned from the window, his face set in grim determination. So we need to be thorough. Document everything. Build a case they can't escape from. He looked at the two women who had become his unlikely allies. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more patients are at risk. Nina nodded, already pulling out her laptop. I can access the hospital's secure servers, track any changes made to patient records. If they're altering data, we'll have proof. I can monitor the oncology ward, Tasha offered. Document any unusual symptoms or reactions that don't make it into the official reports. Carlos picked up one of the falsified trial reports, studying the deliberate deceptions hidden in the data. Each altered number represented a real patient, someone who trusted their doctors to protect them. Someone who deserved better than to be treated as a disposable data point in Pete Wallace's scheme. We do this by the book, he decided. Gather evidence, document everything, build an ironclad case. But we move quickly. He looked at his phone again, at Sylvia's casual message about working late. They've already hurt too many people. We end this before anyone else becomes a victim. As if on cue, his office phone rang. The night nurse from oncology was calling about a patient in the trial who had developed unexpected complications. As Carlos listened to the symptoms, he recognized the pattern from the previous hospital's hidden cases. Another victim of Pete's fraudulent drug trial, another life at risk. I need to check on my patient, he said, grabbing his white coat. Nina, start compiling those records. Tasha, document everything about this new case. We'll meet again tomorrow night. As he hurried toward the oncology ward, Carlos's mind was already formulating plans. He would protect his patients, expose the fraud, and deal with the devastating personal betrayal. But first, he had a life to save, because unlike his wife and Pete Wallace, he had never forgotten what it meant to be a healer. The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan Hospital's records room buzzed quietly as Nina Atkins sifted through another stack of patient files. A week had passed since Tasha's revelation at the fundraiser, and dark circles under Nina's eyes testified to the countless hours she'd spent helping Carlos uncover the extent of Pete and Sylvia's deception. Found another one, she murmured, sliding a file across the desk to Carlos. Patient showed severe liver complications during the trial, but the reported data only mentions mild elevation in enzyme levels. Carlos rubbed his temples, staring at the growing pile of evidence before them. The wall clock read 2:17 a.m., but sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Beside him, Tasha Newton nursed her fourth cup of coffee, highlighting discrepancies in laboratory results. The pattern's consistent, Tasha said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty floor. They're systematically downplaying severe side effects while inflating positive responses. She pushed her reading glasses up with a tired hand. Dr. Maloney, these numbers, real people are being hurt. The door creaked open, causing all three to freeze until they recognized Dr. Sarah Chen's familiar silhouette. Thought I'd find you here, she said, closing the door carefully behind her. You should know. Sylvia's in the West Wing right now, having quite the intimate conversation with Pete in his office. Carlos's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the files before him. The past week had revealed an ugly pattern in his wife's behavior. She'd started staying out all night, not even bothering with excuses anymore. The hospital staff's whispers had grown louder, their pitying glances more obvious. It's not just the affair anymore, Nina said, watching Carlos carefully. The evidence we've gathered shows a deliberate pattern of fraud. Pete's done this before, hasn't he? Sarah nodded, pulling up a chair. I made some calls to colleagues at other hospitals. Pete Wallace has a history of short-term board positions, always coinciding with drug trials that showed suspiciously positive results. And there's always a sales representative involved, but never the same one twice. Carlos finished, finally looking up. They disappear after each successful trial, probably well compensated for their role. His voice carried a bitter edge. Except this time, he chose my wife. A soft knock interrupted them, and one of the night nurses poked her head in. "Dr. Maloney? Your wife is asking for you. She says it's urgent. Something about dinner plans tomorrow?" Carlos exchanged glances with Nina, who gave him a subtle nod. They'd agreed he needed to maintain normalcy while they gathered evidence. "Tell her I'll be right there." After the nurse left, Carlos stood, straightening his lab coat. "Keep digging. There has to be more we're missing." Pete's too experienced to not have contingency plans. Nina caught his arm as he passed. "Carlos, be careful. She's getting bolder with her behavior. Almost like she wants to provoke a reaction." "She's testing his limits," Sarah suggested, "seeing how much he'll tolerate before he snaps." Classic manipulator's strategy. Carlos paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. "What she doesn't realize is that I stopped being her husband the moment I saw those falsified trial reports. Now, I'm just a surgeon trying to protect his patients." As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, Carlos's mind wandered to the moment earlier that day when he discovered something that changed everything. He'd been searching their home office for more evidence when he found a hidden folder in Sylvia's desk. Inside were documents dating back to before their marriage, correspondence between her and Pete, planning their entrance into Metropolitan Hospital. His position as chief surgeon hadn't been a point of pride for her, it had been a target. The realization had hit him like a physical blow. Their entire marriage had been a calculated move in Pete's long game. Every smile, every touch, every whispered "I love you," all part of an elaborate con to gain access to the hospital's drug trials. He found Sylvia waiting by the nurse's station, her designer dress and perfect makeup incongruous with the late hour. Pete stood too close beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. "Carlos, darling." Sylvia's voice carried that artificial sweetness she'd adopted lately. "I was thinking we should host a dinner party tomorrow. Pete has some exciting news about the trial results he wants to share with the board members." Carlos maintained his calm exterior, years of surgical training serving him well. "Of course. Whatever you think is best." He watched as she exchanged a triumphant glance with Pete, mistaking his compliance for submission. "Perfect." She clapped her hands like an excited child. "I'll handle everything. You just need to be there, assuming you're not too busy hiding in your operating room." "I'll be there," Carlos assured her, noting how Pete's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have patients to check on." As he walked away, he heard Pete's low chuckle and Sylvia's answering giggle. They thought they had him figured out, the dedicated surgeon too absorbed in his work to notice his wife's indiscretions. Too professional to make a scene about her increasingly public displays of affection with another man. They had no idea that while they planned their dinner party, Carlos was methodically documenting every falsified report, every altered lab result, every hidden patient complication. Their arrogance would be their downfall. Back in the records room, Nina looked up as Carlos returned. "How did it go?" "They're planning a dinner party for tomorrow night," he said, settling back into his chair. "Pete wants to present the trial results to the board members. They're accelerating their timeline," Tasha observed, alarmed. "If they submit those falsified results." "They won't," Carlos said firmly, pulling a new stack of files closer. "Because we're going to work through the night. We need every piece of evidence ready before that dinner party." As the night deepened into early morning, the four of them continued their meticulous investigation. Outside Pete's office, Sylvia was already making calls, arranging the dinner party that she thought would cement her triumph. Instead, it would mark the beginning of her downfall. But what none of them knew yet was that the documents in Carlos's home office held an even darker secret, one that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his marriage. Carlos's desk as he stared at the manila envelope before him. Inside was every piece of evidence they'd gathered, patient records showing falsified data, emails proving Pete's pattern of fraud at other hospitals, and most damning of all, the documents from his home office revealing Sylvia's premeditated deception. Nina stood, watching the early hospital staff arrive for their shifts. "The FDA will want to investigate thoroughly," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of their decision. "Once we submit this, there's no going back." Carlos nodded, sealing the envelope with deliberate care. The last week had aged him visibly, His normally pristine white coat showed signs of wrinkles from too many nights spent in the records room, and stubble darkened his usually clean-shaven jaw. "I received a call this morning," Nina continued, turning to face him. "From Seattle Presbyterian. Their chief of pediatric surgery is retiring next month. They're interested in your reputation for integrity as much as your surgical skills." A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Chin entered, her face grave. "You need to see this," she said, handing Carlos a tablet. On the screen was an email from Pete to the hospital board, announcing a special meeting that evening to present the trial's groundbreaking results. "They're moving faster than we anticipated," Carlos muttered, scanning the email. The dinner party wasn't enough. "They want official board approval tonight." Nina moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. "We need to act now. If they get board approval—" "They won't," Carlos said firmly, standing up. He picked up his phone, dialing a number he'd memorized days ago. "This is Dr. Carlos Maloney. I need to speak with Special Agent Torres in the FDA's Criminal Investigation Unit. It's regarding fraudulent drug trial data at Metropolitan Hospital." As he made the call, Nina and Sarah exchanged worried glances. They knew this would set off a chain of events that couldn't be stopped. 20 minutes later, Carlos set down his phone. "It's done. The FDA will receive our evidence package by courier within the hour. They're already preparing to launch an official investigation." "What about you?" Nina asked softly. "Once this breaks—" Carlos walked to his office safe, entering the combination with steady hands. Inside was a single envelope containing airline tickets to Seattle, a new apartment lease, and resignation letters, all arranged over the past 3 days. "I won't be here to watch the fallout," he said, removing the envelope. "I have a flight to Seattle tonight. The position at Presbyterian starts next week." He paused, looking at Nina. "I understand if you want to distance yourself from all this." Nina straightened, her administrative professionalism giving way to fierce loyalty. "I already submitted my resignation to the board this morning. Seattle Presbyterian happens to need a new development director." A ghost of a smile touched Carlos's lips, the first in days. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Sylvia. "Don't forget, dinner party tonight. Wear the blue tie I bought you for your birthday. Pete says it brings out your eyes." The casual cruelty of her manipulation settled over the room like a physical presence. Carlos stared at the message, seeing not the words but years of calculated deception behind them. "What are you going to do about the house?" Sarah asked gently. "The accounts?" "Leave it all," Carlos said, his decision made. "The accounts, the house, the cars. She can have everything." He pulled a small note from his desk drawer, reading the words he'd written hours earlier. "You wanted freedom. Now you have it." Nina touched his arm gently. "Carlos, are you sure? That's your entire life." "No," he corrected her, his voice firm. "That was the life she constructed for her con. My real life. My patience, my integrity, my true friends. That comes with me." The day passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Carlos performed his scheduled surgeries with his usual precision, gave detailed instructions to his residents, and methodically cleared his office of personal items. To anyone watching, it seemed like a normal day for the chief surgeon. At 6 p.m., as hospital staff changed shifts and board members began arriving for Pete's presentation, Carlos walked to his car one last time. He placed his note on the kitchen counter of his soon-to-be former home, left his keys and hospital ID on his desk, and sent one final email to the hospital board, his resignation, effective immediately. By the time Sylvia arrived home to prepare for her dinner party, Carlos was already on his way to Seattle, leaving behind a life built on lies and taking with him only his integrity and the truth. His marriage hadn't just ended. It had never really existed. It had been a carefully constructed facade, and now it was time to build something real. The news broke with the fury of a summer storm. Pete Wallace's arrest made headlines across the medical community, his carefully constructed empire of pharmaceutical fraud crumbling in the harsh light of federal investigation. But in the quiet corners of Metropolitan Hospital, the whispers focused on a different story: the disappearance of Dr. Carlos Maloney and the unraveling of his wife's carefully crafted deceptions. Sylvia's transformation from confident manipulator to desperate searcher happened virtually overnight. Her designer clothes gave way to rumpled business suits as she haunted the hospital corridors, accosting anyone who might know Carlos's whereabouts. "Please," she begged Dr. Chun one morning, catching her outside the surgical wing. "He must have told you something. You worked with him for years." Sarah regarded her coldly, remembering nights spent helping gather evidence of Sylvia's betrayal. "The last time I saw Carlos, he was doing what he always did, protecting his patients. Something you and Pete seemed to forget was our primary duty." The investigation expanded like ripples in a pond, touching every aspect of the hospital's operations. FBI agents combed through records, interviewed staff, and slowly pieced together the extent of Pete and Sylvia's fraud. Mrs. Maloney, Special Agent Torres called out as Sylvia attempted to slip past the conference room temporarily serving as the FBI's base. "We need to discuss some inconsistencies in your statement." Sylvia's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. "I've told you everything I know. Pete handled all the data manipulation. I was just following his instructions." Torres's smile held no warmth. "Interesting. Because we found emails suggesting you were involved in similar operations at other hospitals before you ever met Dr. Maloney. Care to explain that?" The color drained from Sylvia's face. She hadn't known they'd found those. "I need to speak with my lawyer," she whispered, backing away from the door. The hospital board, desperate to salvage their reputation, called an emergency meeting. The chairman's hands shook as he read the FDA's preliminary findings. Multiple counts of data falsification, deliberate suppression of adverse reactions, potential manslaughter charges if any deaths can be linked to the drug trials. He looked up at the shocked faces around the table. "How did we miss this?" Dr. Chun cleared her throat. "We didn't all miss it. Carlos saw it, and he made sure the truth came out, even at the cost of his own marriage and position here." The ripples spread further. Private investigators hired by Sylvia hit dead ends at every turn. Carlos had vanished completely, leaving no trace of his new life. Even his closest colleagues maintained a wall of silence, protecting his choice to disappear. Sylvia's desperation grew with each passing day. She hired more investigators, pleaded with mutual friends, and even tried to use the media to send messages to Carlos. But the man who had once been her husband maintained his silence, his absence speaking volumes about the depth of her betrayal. Late one night, weeks after Carlos's disappearance, Nina's replacement found Sylvia sitting in Carlos's old office, staring at the empty walls. "He really loved you, you know," the new development director said quietly. Everyone could see it. Sylvia's laugh held no humor. "Love? He didn't even know me. No one here did." She stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirt. "The real me orchestrated this whole thing. Found out everything about him before we ever accidentally met. Planned every detail of our courtship. Love had nothing to do with it. Then why are you here? Why spend thousands on private investigators if it was all just a con?" Sylvia moved, looking out at the city lights. "Because he beat me at my own game. He saw through everything, gathered his evidence, and disappeared. All while I thought I had him completely fooled." She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "How did I not see it coming?" But as federal agents continued their investigation, they uncovered layers of deception that even Sylvia hadn't anticipated. The trail of fraud led back years before her involvement with Pete, suggesting a larger conspiracy that was still unfolding. The hospital's legal team worked overtime to protect their institution's reputation. Press releases emphasized their full cooperation with federal investigators and their commitment to patient safety. But in the break rooms and corridors, staff whispered about the real story, how their chief surgeon had sacrificed everything to expose the truth. In the end, Sylvia managed to negotiate a deal with federal prosecutors, trading her detailed knowledge of Pete's operations for immunity from prosecution. But her victory felt hollow as she walked the halls of the hospital for the last time, packing up her office under the watchful eyes of security. As she left the building, she passed the wall where Carlos's photograph had once hung among the other department heads. Now there was just an empty space, a fitting metaphor for what remained of their marriage. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Carlos had taken more than just evidence when he disappeared. He had uncovered secrets that went beyond mere pharmaceutical fraud, secrets that would eventually force Sylvia to confront the true cost of her deceptions. Seattle's autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Pacific Northwest Pediatric Care Center. Dr. Carlos Maloney stood in his office, reviewing surgical schedules while the city lights blurred behind sheets of water streaming down the glass. 7 years had carved new lines around his eyes, but they'd also given him something he'd lost in Metropolitan Hospital: peace. Nina's gentle knock drew his attention from the window. She entered with 2 cups of coffee, setting one on his desk with the familiarity of long partnership. "The Williams boys' post-op results look promising," she said, settling into her usual chair. "The board is thrilled with the success rates of your new surgical technique." Carlos smiled, noting how naturally Nina had transitioned from development director to medical center administrator. Their shared vision had transformed this facility into one of the country's leading pediatric centers. More than that, their friendship had evolved into something deeper, though neither had rushed to define it. "Remember when we first came here?" Nina asked, her eyes distant with memory. "You were so focused on rebuilding, on proving that what happened at Metropolitan couldn't define you." "We both were," Carlos replied, taking a sip of coffee. "Though I think you had more faith in me than I had in myself back then." The comfortable moment was interrupted by Carlos's assistant, Rachel, appearing in the doorway. Her face held an uncertainty that immediately put both of them on alert. "Dr. Maloney? There's someone here to see you." "She's very insistent." Rachel's hesitation spoke volumes. "She says her name is Sylvia Meyer." The coffee cup in Carlos's hand froze halfway to his lips. Nina straightened in her chair, 7 years of carefully constructed peace suddenly threatened by a ghost from the past. "She's not alone," Rachel added quietly. "There's a child with her." The rain seemed to pound louder as Carlos set down his cup with deliberate care. "Send them in." Nina started to rise, but Carlos shook his head. "Stay, please." The quiet request carried years of shared trust. Sylvia's entrance was like a clash of past and present. She wore expensive clothes, but they were wrinkled from travel. Her hair, once perfectly styled, showed signs of nervous fidgeting. But it was the boy clutching her hand that drew Carlos's immediate attention. The child, around 6 years old, had Pete Wallace's distinctive nose and jaw structure. The resemblance was so striking that Carlos felt his medical training kick in, automatically cataloging inherited features. "Carlos," Sylvia's voice trembled slightly. "I know I'm the last person you want to see. Why are you here, Sylvia?" The question came from Nina, her protective instincts evident in her tone. Sylvia's eyes darted between them, noting their proximity, the easy familiarity of their shared space. Something like resignation flickered across her face before she squared her shoulders. "This is Jason," she said, gently urging the boy forward. "Your son." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against glass. Carlos studied the child more carefully now, his surgeon's eye noting every detail that proved Sylvia's claim impossible. "He was conceived during our last month together," Sylvia continued, her words rushing out. "I didn't know until after. After everything." "No," Carlos said quietly, his voice carrying the certainty of medical knowledge. "He wasn't." The boy, Jason, looked up at him with curious eyes, clearly old enough to understand he was the subject of discussion, but too young to grasp its significance. Carlos noticed how he leaned slightly away from Sylvia despite her grip on his hand. "Carlos, please." Sylvia's composure cracked slightly. "I know I've done unforgivable things, but Jason needs—" "He has Pete's features," Carlos interrupted, his voice clinical. "The nasal bridge, the mandibular structure, even the slight asymmetry of the orbital bones." "I'm a surgeon, Sylvia. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Nina had risen slowly, moving to stand beside Carlos. Her presence steadied him, as it had so many times over the past 7 years. "Why now?" she asked, her administrator's instincts picking up on the desperation beneath Sylvia's polished surface. "Why come here with a lie that any doctor could disprove?" Sylvia's grip on Jason's hand tightened, causing the boy to wince slightly. The reaction didn't escape Carlos's notice. Years of working with pediatric patients had made him acutely attuned to signs of distress in children. "Jason," he said gently, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "There's a really cool playroom just down the hall. Would you like to check it out while we grown-ups talk?" The boy looked up at Sylvia, who nodded tightly. Rachel, understanding without words, stepped forward to guide him out. As soon as the door closed, Sylvia seemed to deflate. "Pete's being released," she whispered. "Early parole for good behavior. He knows about Jason, and he's made threats." "Start from the beginning," Carlos said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The truth this time." And as the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, Sylvia began to unravel a story that made their previous scandal seem almost simple in comparison. With each word, Carlos understood that his past wasn't just returning. It was bringing with it a darkness that would force him to choose between the peace he'd built and the oath he'd taken to protect those who needed help. Nina's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the strength of shared battles and victory. Whatever storm Sylvia was bringing to their door, they would weather it together. The playroom's bright colors and cheerful decorations stood in sharp contrast to the heavy atmosphere in Carlos's office as Sylvia's story spilled out in desperate bursts. "Marla Preston was Pete's mistress before I met him," she began, pacing between the windows. "She worked in research at his previous hospital. When she got pregnant, Pete saw it as a threat to his position, his reputation." She paused, swallowing hard. "He asked me to help. Handle the situation." "Handle it how?" Nina's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "I was supposed to convince her to terminate the pregnancy, offer her money to disappear." Sylvia's hands twisted together. But Marla refused. She said her baby deserved to know its father. She threatened to expose everything. The fraud, the affairs, all of it. Carlos leaned forward, his surgical instincts sensing the approaching core of the infection. "What happened to her, Sylvia?" "Pete. He said he just wanted to talk to her. I arranged the meeting." Tears began sliding down Sylvia's cheeks. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he would. There was a car accident. They said she lost control on a wet road. But it wasn't an accident," Nina concluded quietly. Sylvia shook her head, dropping into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "Pete made sure all the evidence pointed to driver error. But he kept trophies, documents, photos, insurance papers with his signature." Her voice broke. "I found them when I was helping him move offices after the trial started. That's when I realized what he was capable of." "And Jason?" Carlos prompted, though he already suspected the answer. "Marla's son." She had listed her sister as guardian in her will, but the sister died of cancer 2 years ago. Sylvia's words came faster now, tumbling over each other. "Pete wanted to eliminate any trace of his connection to Marla. He forged documents, made it look like the sister had given me custody before she died." "Why you?" Nina asked, her administrative mind picking apart the logistics. "Because I was already compromised. The fraud investigation, the trial. Pete knew I'd do anything to stay out of prison." Sylvia laughed bitterly. "He said taking Jason would prove my loyalty, give him leverage if I ever thought about talking." Carlos stood, moving to the window. Below, he could see the playroom where Jason was showing Rachel something on a drawing pad. The boy's features, so like Pete's, now carried a weight of tragedy. "And now Pete's being released," he said, his reflection grim in the rain-streaked glass. "He's already made contact through his lawyers," Sylvia confirmed. "He wants Jason. Says he'll expose my role in Marla's death if I don't cooperate. He's even hinted that accidents can run in families." Nina's sharp intake of breath matched Carlos's own tension. 7 years of peace suddenly seemed like a distant dream. "That's why you came here," Nina realized. "Not just to hide behind Carlos, but because you knew he'd help protect Jason once he knew the truth." "You always could see right through me," Sylvia acknowledged, glancing at Nina with something like respect. "Yes. Carlos's reputation for integrity, his position here, his relationship with you." She gestured between them. "Pete can't touch him now. And this center has resources, connections, that you want to use to protect yourself," Carlos finished, turning back to face her. "To protect Jason, Sylvia corrected, but her eyes slid away from his steady gaze. Pete will destroy him, Carlos, either by claiming him or removing him. You know what he's capable of now. Carlos shared a long look with Nina, years of unspoken communication passing between them. She gave him a slight nod, understanding as always. We'll need everything, he said finally. Every document, every piece of evidence about Marla's death. And you'll have to testify. Pete will kill me, Sylvia whispered. No, Nina said firmly, already reaching for her phone. He won't. Because we're going to do this right this time. Full protection, federal marshals, everything by the book. Why would you help me? Sylvia asked, looking between them. After everything I did, we're not helping you, Carlos said quietly, watching Jason through the window. We're helping a little boy who never asked to be part of this nightmare. Just like we helped those patients you and Pete endangered 7 years ago. A knock at the door heralded Rachel's return with Jason. The boy clutched a drawing in his hands, his face brightening as he held it up to show them. I drew my house, he announced proudly. The one I lived in with my first mom before she went to heaven. Sylvia flinched, but Carlos crouched down to examine the drawing with appropriate seriousness. That's very good, Jason. Would you like to tell me about your first mom? As the boy launched into a detailed description of Marla Preston's garden and her chocolate chip pancakes, Carlos felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This child was more than just Pete Wallace's son or a victim of circumstance. He was a chance for redemption, not for Sylvia or Pete, but for a system that had failed to protect his mother. Nina was already on the phone in the corner, her quiet voice carrying fragments of words like witness protection and federal investigation. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, though darker clouds loomed on the horizon. The storm was coming, but this time, they would be ready. The federal courthouse stood imposing against the gray Seattle sky, its stone facade a silent witness to the stream of dark SUVs and police vehicles converging on its steps. Inside, in a carefully secured courtroom, Pete Wallace's carefully constructed world was about to shatter. Carlos sat in the front row beside Nina, their shoulders touching in silent support. Jason was safely ensconced in a federal safe house, surrounded by marshals and child psychologists who were helping him understand his role in the unfolding drama. The door opened, and Pete entered in handcuffs, his prison pallor a sharp contrast to the confident man who had once commanded hospital boardrooms. His eyes locked onto Sylvia, who sat rigid beside her lawyers across the aisle. All rise, the bailiff called as Judge Elena Martinez entered, her robes flowing behind her like a banner of justice. The proceedings moved with the precision of a well-planned surgery. The prosecutor, Sarah Chun, a welcome familiar face from Metropolitan Hospital who had followed the case from the beginning, laid out the evidence with devastating clarity. The state will prove that the defendant, Peter Wallace, did willfully and with premeditation cause the death of Marla Preston, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. We will show how he used his position and influence to cover up this crime, and how he continued to manipulate and threaten others to maintain that cover-up. Carlos watched as each piece of evidence was presented. The insurance documents bearing Pete's signature, the maintenance records showing tampering with Marla's car, the threatening emails to Sylvia. But it was Sylvia's testimony that held the courtroom spellbound. He told me it would be easy, she said, her voice smaller than Carlos remembered. Just arrange a meeting, make sure no one else was around. I thought he was just going to talk to her. She broke down, years of guilt finally finding voice. I helped him destroy the evidence afterward, changed dates on documents, created false alibis. I told myself it was just another cover-up, like the drug trials. Pete's lawyer tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, but the evidence was too solid, too well documented. When the federal agents testified about finding Marla's hidden diary in Pete's storage unit, detailing her fears and suspicions, even Pete's confident smirk began to fade. During a brief recess, Nina touched Carlos's arm. Jason's art therapist just sent an update. He's doing well, actually seeming relieved to talk about his mother. Carlos nodded, remembering the boy's drawings, not just of his mother's house, but of dark figures and scary men, of documents hidden in walls and whispered threats. The artwork had become part of the evidence, a child's testimony that no cross-examination could shake. The verdict, when it came, felt like the release of a long-held breath. Guilty on all counts. Life sentence. No possibility of parole. Pete's mask finally cracked as the handcuffs clicked shut. "You think this ends here?" he snarled at Sylvia. "You're nothing without me. You'll always be nothing." But Sylvia wasn't looking at him. She was watching Carlos and Nina, seeing something in their steady presence that made her straighten her shoulders. "No, Pete," she said quietly. "You're the one who's nothing without your schemes and threats. I see that now." Later, in the judge's chambers, another scene played out, one that would shape Jason's future. Nina had made the suggestion during trial preparation, and Carlos had known immediately it was right. "You understand this is an unusual situation," Judge Martinez said, reviewing the adoption papers. "Dr. Maloney, Ms. Atkins, you're aware of the challenges involved in adopting a child with such a complex background?" "We are, Your Honor," Nina answered, her hand finding Carlos's. "But Jason needs stability, a home where he'll be safe and loved, where his mother's memory will be honored, not hidden." The judge studied them over her glasses. "And you, Ms. Meyer? You're willing to terminate all parental rights?" Sylvia, now dressed in the simple clothes provided by the Witness Protection Program, nodded. "Jason deserves better than a life on the run. And they—" She glanced at Carlos and Nina. "They can give him what I never could. Truth. Safety. A real family." The signing of the papers felt momentous yet simple, like all life-changing moments sometimes do. As the judge's seal pressed into the document, Carlos felt the weight of the past 7 years finally lifting. "There's one more thing," he said suddenly, pulling out a medical file. "During Jason's standard pre-adoption physical, I noticed some unusual genetic markers. They matched a case I saw years ago. A patient who turned out to be Pete's illegitimate brother." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Making the connection to Marla Preston's claims about paternity absolutely certain, and ensuring Pete can never contest the adoption," Nina added, her administrator's mind always 3 steps ahead. As they left the courthouse, the Seattle rain had given way to weak sunlight. Sylvia paused on the steps, preparing to leave with her witness protection detail. "I did love you," she said to Carlos. "In the beginning, before Pete twisted everything. I just didn't know how to love someone good." Carlos looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 7 years. "I hope you learn," he said simply. "Wherever you end up, I hope you find peace." She nodded once, then walked away, disappearing into her new life with quiet dignity that had eluded her in her old one. The pediatric center thrived in the years that followed. Carlos and Nina's partnership, both professional and personal, deepened with each challenge they faced together. Jason bloomed under their care, his artistic talents finding expression in bright murals that transformed the hospital's corridors into storybook adventures. One evening, as Seattle's endless rain drummed against the windows, Carlos found Jason in his study, holding the memory box from the attic. Inside lay the red dress that had once symbolized so much pain, along with the note he'd left and Sylvia's final confession letter. "Dad." Jason's voice carried the weight of a 13-year-old trying to understand his complex history. "Will you tell me the whole story now? About how you and Mom found me?" Nina appeared in the doorway, carrying 3 mugs of hot chocolate. Her presence, as always, made the difficult moments easier to navigate. "It's quite a story," Carlos said, accepting a mug. "But I think you're old enough to understand it now." As the rain played its steady rhythm, Carlos shared the tale, not just of scandal and betrayal, but of how sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted could lead you to everything you truly needed. "You chose me," Jason said finally, his fingers tracing the edges of the memory box. "When you didn't have to. When you knew whose son I really was." "Biology doesn't make a family," Nina said softly, sitting beside them. "Love does. Choice does." Carlos looked at his son. This boy who had arrived as a reminder of past betrayals but had become a symbol of redemption, and saw only possibility. The genetic markers that linked him to Pete Wallace meant nothing compared to the courage and compassion he showed every day. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy Carlos's career had instead become a catalyst for positive change. The Pediatric Center's protocols for pharmaceutical trials had become a model for hospitals nationwide. Nina's management reforms were studied in medical administration courses. And somewhere, in a new life under a new name, Sylvia was hopefully learning what they had all discovered, that redemption begins with truth. In the end, it wasn't just about justice being served or wrongs being righted. It was about the family they had built from the ashes of betrayal, stronger because they had chosen each other. The red dress in the memory box remained as a reminder not of what was lost, but of what was found, proof that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, if you're brave enough to follow the light. Epilogue. 15 years later. The Metropolitan Hospital's auditorium buzzed with anticipation as medical professionals from across the country gathered for the National Conference on Medical Ethics and Patient Safety. Dr. Sarah Chen, now the hospital's chief of medicine, stood at the podium, introducing their keynote speaker. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Carlos Maloney, whose groundbreaking work in pediatric surgical procedures is matched only by his contributions to medical ethics and trial protocol reform. The Wallace-Meyer incident, as many of you know, led to the establishment of the Medical Trial Integrity Act, which has protected countless patients over the past 15 years. Carlos approached the podium, his hair now threaded with distinguished gray, Nina's supportive presence in the front row grounding him as always. Their matching wedding rings caught the light, a relatively recent addition from 2 years ago, after Jason had practically orchestrated the proposal himself. 15 years ago, Carlos began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. This very hospital was the epicenter of one of medicine's darkest ethical breaches. Today, I want to talk about the changes that emerged from that darkness and the lives saved by those reforms. In the audience, familiar faces brought back memories. Dr. Tasha Newton, now heading Metropolitan's oncology department, sat beside her research team. Her whistleblower protection program had become a model for hospitals nationwide. As Carlos presented the statistical impact of the reforms, thousands of lives saved by stricter trial protocols, hundreds of fraudulent schemes prevented, his thoughts drifted to those who had precipitated these changes, albeit unintentionally. Pete Wallace's life sentence had made headlines again recently. His attempt to appeal had been denied, the evidence of Marla Preston's murder remaining insurmountable. Prison had not been kind to him. Recent photos showed a hollow-eyed man, his once charismatic features ravaged by time and consequence. His pharmaceutical empire had crumbled, its assets redistributed to victim compensation funds and medical research grants. Sylvia's path had been different. Through witness protection channels, Carlos occasionally received updates. She had rebuilt her life in Arizona under a new name, working as a high school science teacher. Her last letter, received 5 years ago, spoke of finding peace and helping students understand the importance of ethical choices. She never remarried, dedicating herself instead to volunteer work with domestic violence survivors, perhaps finding redemption and helping others escape manipulation. The Wallace-Meyer incident, Carlos continued his speech, taught us that ethical breaches in medicine don't just happen in dramatic moments. They occur in small compromises, in looked-away moments, in the quiet spaces where we choose convenience over conscience. Nina watched from her seat, pride evident in her expression. The Pacific Northwest Pediatric Care Center they'd built together had revolutionized children's healthcare. Their innovative management model, combining rigorous ethical oversight with compassionate care, was being implemented in hospitals across the country. In the back of the auditorium, 21-year-old Jason Maloney sat quietly, his medical textbooks open on his lap. His decision to follow his adoptive father into medicine had surprised no one, though his chosen specialty, forensic pathology, reflected his unique perspective on justice and truth. The genetic condition that had confirmed his parentage had led to another revelation years later. Through DNA databases, they had discovered other half-siblings, children Pete Wallace had fathered and abandoned across his years of hospital schemes. Jason had formed relationships with several of them, creating a support network for those dealing with their complicated patrimony. But the most important lesson, Carlos continued, wasn't about protocols or oversight. It was about community. The reforms we instituted weren't just regulatory changes, they were cultural ones. We created systems where ethical concerns could be raised without fear, where patient safety trumped profit margins, where integrity became more than just a buzzword in mission statements. In the years following the scandal, Metropolitan Hospital had undergone a complete transformation. Sarah Chin's leadership, built on the foundations of those hard-learned lessons, had turned it into a beacon of medical ethics. The annual ethics conference, now in its 10th year, drew healthcare professionals from around the world. The old guard had largely moved on. Several board members who had enabled Pete's schemes had faced their own legal consequences. Others had retired quietly, their reputations permanently tarnished. But from that upheaval, a new generation of medical leaders had emerged, shaped by the lessons of the past. After the speech, during the reception, Carlos found himself in his old office, now Sarah's, looking out at the familiar skyline. Nina joined him, their hands finding each other automatically. "Strange being back?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "Not strange," he replied. "More like completing a circle. Everything that happened here, all the pain and betrayal, it led to something bigger than us. Real change." A knock at the door revealed Jason, his father's surgical precision combined with his mother's artistic soul evident in his bearing. "Dad, Mom, they're ready for the panel discussion on whistleblower protection reforms." As they walked together through the hospital corridors, Carlos noticed the changes. Walls once adorned with donor plaques now displayed patient safety achievements. The pharmaceutical trials wing, once Pete's domain, had been transformed into a transparent research center with public oversight committees. The panel discussion brought together key figures from the Wallace-Meyer incident. Tasha Newton spoke about the importance of speaking up. Sarah Chun discussed institutional responsibility. Nina addressed administrative reforms. And Carlos, with Jason beside him, talked about the personal cost of maintaining integrity and the greater cost of compromising it. Later that evening, at a small dinner gathering in their old neighborhood, the conversation turned personal. Sarah Chin raised her glass in a toast. "To those who stood up when it would have been easier to look away," she said, "and to the changes that came from their courage." Jason, who had grown into a thoughtful young man with his father's integrity and his own hard-won wisdom, added his own toast. "To chosen family," he said, looking at Carlos and Nina, "and to the truth that sets us free." The ripples of the Wallace-Meyer incident continued to spread. Pete Wallace's case was now studied in medical ethics courses. Sylvia's role was analyzed in psychology classes examining manipulation and redemption. But the real legacy lived in the thousands of patients protected by stronger protocols, in the whistleblowers empowered to speak up, in the cultural shift toward ethical practice over profit. In Carlos and Nina's Seattle home, the memory box in the attic had been joined by other markers of their journey. Jason's medical school acceptance letter, news clippings about the reforms they championed, photos of their growing family, not just Jason, but the diverse group of people who had become part of their lives through shared purpose and commitment to truth. The red dress that had once symbolized betrayal now served as a teaching tool in ethics seminars, a tangible reminder that the smallest compromises could lead to the greatest falls. But beside it lay symbols of redemption. Sylvia's work with abuse survivors, Pete's victims finding justice, and most importantly, the countless lives saved by the changes their story had sparked. As the Seattle rain drummed its familiar rhythm, Carlos stood in his study, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt stronger than before. On his desk lay a letter, an invitation to chair the National Medical Ethics Board. Beside it sat a photo of him, Nina, and Jason at Jason's medical school white coat ceremony. The boy who had arrived on their doorstep as a reminder of betrayal had indeed become a symbol of redemption. But more than that, he had become himself, a young man determined to protect truth and justice in his own way. Nina entered with their evening coffee, a routine unchanged through years of partnership. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "Just reflecting," he replied, accepting the cup. "On how the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." Through the window, they could see the lights of their pediatric center, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Inside those walls, new generations of medical professionals were being trained in both surgical technique and ethical practice. The lessons of the past were ensuring a better future. The Wallace-Meyer incident had ended, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond those directly involved. In the end, it wasn't just a story of betrayal and justice. It was a testament to the power of truth, the strength of chosen family, and the enduring triumph of integrity over expedience. The slit dress in the memory box remained as a reminder, not of what was lost, but of what was gained, proof that sometimes we must lose everything we thought we wanted to find everything we truly need. And in that finding, create changes that outlive our own stories. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.